Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Good evening and welcome to this Convocation of the Laity convened by the Australasian Catholic Coalition for Church Reform, a coalition of 18 groups and organisations in Australia and New Zealand committed to the reform of our beloved church. We are joined by people from across the globe, so welcome to you all. I'd like to acknowledge the First Nations peoples and all the peoples and nations gathered here tonight. My name is Christina Raymer from Be the Change in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as you can probably get from my accent. This convocation is sponsored by the SACCC, the South Australia Catholics for an Evolving Church, the YTU, the Yarra Theological Union, and the University of Divinity in Melbourne, and also Garratt Publishing, who look after the technical side of the Zoom gathering. We have over 2,000 people registered for this extraordinary event, and a testament to the interest in this convocation and in the Synod on Synodality, initiated by Pope Francis in 2021, and has set the church on a new way of being church, which is often referred to as the synodal way. So let's begin with a reflection. And this reflection comes to us from Bishop Geoffrey Robinson, who wrote this shortly before his death, reflecting on his life. This is excerpts from his song. In everything he did and in everything he said, Jesus Christ sang a song. The disciples heard him thought that this was the most beautiful song they had ever heard. And after he'd returned to his Father, they began to sing it to others. Sometimes in the lives of the great saints, the song was sung with exquisite beauty. One of the last places the song reached was the land that would later be called Australia. At first, the song was sung very badly indeed, for the beauty of the song was drowned by the lash on the backs of the convicts and the cries of fear in the Aboriginal people. At last, the song came down to me, sung softly, gently, and lovingly by my parents. Like so many millions of people before me, I too was captivated by the song, and I wanted to sing and dance it with my whole being. The song must not stop with our generation, and we, in turn, must hand on its beauty to those who come after us. And that's why we're here. So, the topic is Synod on Synodality. Why we should care. Synodality is a church word for inclusive leadership, listening to the sense of the faithful, a rejection of autocratic and patriarchal decision-making processes. And as I said, Pope Francis initiated this process in 2021, process of consulting with the people of God, lay and religious, clerical, all sorts, and particularly the marginalised, including those who have left, and in some cases have left in droves. And it's set to culminate in the Synod on Synodality, which will be held in 2 sessions in October this year, 2023, and also October 2024. So over the last 2 years, we've supposedly been consulted, listened to, and listened to others at parish and community level, in our dioceses and in our nations. The proceedings have been collated into national statements and then synthesised to produce our continental documents of the 7 continents globally. A group met in Frascati near Rome in October 2022 to bring these 7 continental documents together, and this has been given back to us as a document on of the continental stage, enlarging the space of our tent. So this is what's being discussed at the continents all over in the next few months. Our Bishops' Conferences of Oceania, so that is Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands and the Pacific Nations are meeting in Fiji next week to finalise our submission on the Synod to the Synod on Synodality. They'll be meeting with Sister Natalie Garratt, the Secretary of the Synod of Bishops, who is in Australia at present. So it is with this, and this is what we are about to discuss. So the way it will work is this. We'll begin with an introduction by video from Archbishop Timothy Costello, President of the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference, who was not able to join us live in light of Synod commitments. We will then hear from 4 other speakers, some live and some by pre-recorded video, who've been involved in the synodal process to date. You, as participants in this process, will be able to put questions to the panelists via the chat function in your Zoom link. The chat will only be visible during the presentations to the panelists and the moderator, but will be visible to all during the question and answer session. So, while we're not able to field all questions limited to time, we will have an independent moderator who will assist me in selecting questions that have a common theme, mindful also of needing to honour the diversity of views that may come forward. So please avoid making statements or comments. We'll restrict you to actual questions, and we'll ask you to be respectful of the panelists and of us all as in the questions that you put. We anticipate that tonight's event will run for an hour and a half and will be recorded so that registered participants may access it and listen to it again at a later date. So, thank you all, and let's get started. Let's start with that introduction from Archbishop Timothy Costello. Thank you, David.
I'm very glad to have this opportunity to greet all of you who have gathered for this important opportunity to reflect on the ongoing preparations for the Synod on Synodality, which is to take place in a formal way in Rome in October of this year and again in October of next year. We're all very well aware that something very important is taking place in the life of the Catholic Church in this time in the Church's history. The gift of Pope Francis and his leadership in the Church is something unexpected, something precious, and something full of promise. It is he who has invited us to walk together on the road to a more synodal Church. In doing so, he is calling us in the first instance to listen deeply, attentively, respectfully, and with open hearts and minds to each other. He calls us to listen to those who confirm our own intuitions and to those who challenge them. To listen to those who speak our language and use our categories which make sense to us, and to those whose language and whose categories are different to ours. To listen to those whose experience of the Church reflects our own, and to those whose experience tells a different story. Without this listening from everyone in the Church, we run the very real and frightening risk of missing the voice of the Holy Spirit, which will emerge, which can be caught, discerned, speaking in and through and above and under, and indeed sometimes over the multiplicity of voices which will be heard if we truly are listening, not in an echo chamber, but in an open and large-hearted way. You're one of many groups of people with a passionate commitment to the Church and with profound hopes for the Church, who are meeting at this time to offer your contribution to the ongoing synodal journey to which Pope Francis has invited us. The key point for us all, I believe, is that this process is a journey. It is a process rather than an event. As someone who has found himself drawn into this journey more deeply than I had expected, I'm realising more and more how much our own journey of the Plenary Council has anticipated and prepared us here in Australia for the Synod on Synodality. The questions we have grappled with through the journey of the Plenary Council are very much the questions the Synod will grapple with. Similarly, the challenges we have confronted are very much the challenges which the Synod presents to us. I'm full of hope, but also I think realistic about how well, or in some cases perhaps not so well, we have succeeded in turning our minds and hearts to the fundamental question of the Plenary Council, which in my mind is also the fundamental question for the Synod. What is it that God is asking of us in the Church at this moment in our history? This is and must be the fundamental question of our discernment. It's too easy to presume that what I want or what we want is necessarily what God wants. It may well be, of course, but as soon as we presume that it is, we are no longer in harmony with the Lord's Prayer. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, and have formulated a new prayer. My or our kingdom come, my or our will be done. I'm well aware that these brief reflections do not magically make things clear or easy. On the contrary, they ask of us, indeed demand of us, that we come to grips with the challenging and confronting question of discernment. What are the elements, the tools of discernment, without which we cannot be sure that within the community of the disciples of Christ, with its long journey through history, we are truly opening ourselves to the leading of God's Spirit? In other words, what do we as the Catholic community draw on as we seek to discern the way forward? This is an invitation to us to embrace the both and rather than the either or. As Catholics, we are always confronting this challenge. God is not either one or three, but both one and three. Jesus is not either human or divine, but both human and divine. For all of us, this means that we must be brave enough to open ourselves radically and without conditions to the wisdom of the Holy Spirit, who will surely lead the Church into the surprising future which God has prepared for us, if we're ready to receive it. The journey of the Synod, much like the journey of our own Plenary Council, is what Archbishop Coleridge has often spoken of as an Abrahamic journey, a call to set out in trust on a journey whose destination in its details is not yet clear to us. The worst thing we could do is to decide today what the destination must look like in all its details. That would be to claim for ourselves the agency which properly belongs to the Spirit of God. We cannot lead, much less manipulate, the Holy Spirit. It is the Spirit who will lead us if we are prepared to let ourselves be led. As you gather together to make your contribution to the synodal journey, which is being undertaken by the Church right around the world, may your reflections and the positions you reach be expressions of your listening to the voice of the Holy Spirit, so that they may find their rightful place in the discernment which the Pope has invited us all to undertake. I wish you all well. Thank you for your commitment to the Lord's Church and assure you of my prayers. Thank you.
Thank you. Those were insightful words, and ones that I think will set us on that journey. It is a journey with open-ended, and where it takes us, none of us can know or predict. So now it's for me to ask Susan Pascoe, who's been on that journey in a very intimate way, to talk to us and explain a bit more about that journey to date and where she sees it taking us forward from here. So thank you, Susan, and I'll open it up to you.
Thank you. And can I note that in keeping with the welcome to country or the acknowledgement of country, I'm here in Victoria, Australia, in the Wurundjeri lands of the Kulin Nature, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm just going to give my short 8 minutes with a bit of an insider's perspective on the way that this synod is unfolding, and then hopefully where it might lead us. I think we're very fortunate to have that introduction by Archbishop Timothy Costello. It gives a really solid grounding in what's expected in terms of the discernment process and the essential journey of a synod. But if we first of all think about it, this was initiated in April 2 years ago by the Pope in one of his meetings, in fact, with the General Secretary of the Synod Secretariat, Cardinal Garratt, noting, of course, that any synods are overseen by the General Secretariat. Was originally the General Secretariat for the Synod of Bishops, but increasingly is simply called the General Secretariat for the Synod, created in the closing days of Vatican II by Paul VI, when it was clear to those bishops assembled that there was a fraternity, a collegiality, which meant that they could support one another and together contribute to the life and teachings of the Church, and together be a support with and for the Pope. So when we think about this synod on synodality, the title being is for a synodal church, communion, participation, mission, it brings forth the ecclesiology from Vatican II with the notion of the Church as a pilgrim people journeying together in all levels of the Church. So lay people, religious, ordained, and so on. And in fact, when we look at what was said at the opening of the Synod on the 9th of October 2021, Pope Francis made a strong emphasis on that it involves all the people of God, and used this phrase, baptism is your identity card, which is one that resonates through. So let's think about the key elements of this synod. It's somewhat unique in that it's got 4 stages. Previous synods have really only had 3. We've finished the first stage. That was from the 17th of October 21, when the local churches had their opening masses, and finished on the 15th of August last year, 22. There were extraordinary numbers of submissions presented. Some 112 of the 114 Episcopal conferences presented a submission. Well over 1,000 individual submissions were provided. And there was a process in Frascati, just outside of Rome, where people were brought together to create a summary or a synthesis of some 2,000 pages that had come forward from the people of God around the world, and arguably the largest single consultation ever held within the Church or beyond. So what was produced is a document called Enlarge the Space in Your Tent, the working document for the continental stage. So we are now in the continental stage, but we have that global synthesis from all of those submissions around the world that is the focus in this stage. So what's happening in this stage? The 7 regions or the continents, bearing in mind that one of those is actually the Eastern Catholic churches. So in fact, they're not technically geographic regions, all of them, but our role there is to focus on that document for the continental stage, to discern more deeply, to ask ourselves, does it really speak to the truth of the experience of church in our setting, and then feed that back. So there will be, coming from this stage, with a deadline of the 31st of March this year, the 7 continents will submit back to the Vatican, and then that will be synthesized, and that will go to the 3rd point I've made in this slide, to the 2 assemblies. So that will go to the first of the assemblies in October this year. And there, as we know, only about 6 weeks ago, Pope Francis announced that there would be 2 assemblies, with the notion that there would be feedback to the local churches. So you can see there's this notion of circularity, that it's an invitation again to the people of God, all of the people of God, to have a say. And then finally, of course, there's the implementation. What are we looking at in an Australian context? And I'm conscious that there are people, I'm told, on this Zoom from many other places, so I'll go through fairly quickly. We had in this country a Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, and that's definitely part of the context within which we go into this synodal process. We've recently completed the plenary council, which was really a 5-year process and resulted in reports, many of which were for implementation in the local church, but some for Rome to consider. For Australia, we have a belated attempt at reconciliation with Indigenous people through the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the request through political processes this year that there be an Indigenous voice to Parliament. And for all of us, or most of us on this call, we are conscious that next week in Suva, there will be the delayed meeting, it's an Episcopal meeting of the Federation of Catholic Bishops' Conferences of Oceania, noting that they have a rotational presidency and the next presidency is slated for an Australian. And another factor, I think, in which we're all making this synodal journey is the recent unexpected death of Cardinal Pell, following probably less unexpected death of Pope Benedict. So moving on, just in terms of what happened in that Frascati process, the reason I want to emphasise this a little bit is to note the richness that came forward, but also the extraordinary integrity in the process. I'm not going to have enough time to go into real detail, but you can see there an extraordinary number of submissions. They were supposed to be 10 pages, many exceeded that. And each of us, 30 of us, were invited, including Archbishop Costello, to be there to go into a 2-week discernment process, but ahead of that, to thoroughly familiarise ourselves with somewhere between 10 and 20 of those submissions so that we could speak to them in enormous detail. I mentioned we had all those additional submissions that were separately summarised and fed into the process. And then there was a digital synod that had, in fact, millions of clicks and tens of thousands of people fill in a 38-question questionnaire. So there was a lot of information coming through other streams of data. 30 people there, 3 Aussies, including Father Orm Rush, the noted theologian whose expertise is in Vatican II. We used the methodology of the spiritual conversation and the discernment in common, which of course has been used across the first stage, where in parishes, dioceses, lay movements, concerned Catholic groups and so on, that was used. We had our 2 weeks of work and discernment, a lot of time for prayer and listening, liturgy, but then there was a 2.5-day process at the end of it where the council that governs the General Secretariat came, familiarised themselves, and then went through an approval process for that document. And on that Council of Ordinaries, we have Archbishop Anthony Fisher. We met with the Pope as part at the very end of that process, all of us, including the council, and we were able to feed into him what the process had been like. And finally, just to emphasise that the process itself was prayerful. We put enormous effort into being faithful to what had come through from all of those submissions. It was a process of great integrity and a very robust process. And of course, all of that information is what then fed into the creation of the document for the continental stage. So here we are now in the continental stage, and just for your information, the images there's Archbishop Lloyd Chong, who is the current president of the Federation of Catholic Bishops' Conferences of Oceania and the host of the assembly in Suva next week. And the group photo is of a group that was assembled in Melbourne from the 8th to the 13th of January this year, where we went through the 4 submissions from the Episcopal conferences here in Oceania, and a submission also from the Eastern Catholic Churches. We went through a similar process to Frascati. We generated a draft document, and that document in fact, went to the participants of the FCBCO assembly in time for them to familiarise themselves, because there are 2 discernment sessions when they're in Suva together. I want to make one, before I go into the leadership, I want to make a final note about the finalisation of that Oceania submission, and that is that we will, from those discernment sessions, be making any adjustments to that draft document, but the finalisation of the document will be a combined online meeting between the FCBCO executive and the discernment and writing group, so that you can get a more ecclesial focus in that finalisation of the submission from Oceania. I just want to make one point, and that is that the Pope himself is heavily invested in this process. And if you read his writings, you'll see an enormous interest in the church becoming a synodal church. We can talk about that in the questions if you like, but just to give you a sense, he was briefed on the very first draft that was created in Frascati. He met with the group, and he called the members of what's called the continental federations, with the presidents of each of those continents and the persons responsible for the continental stage, to a meeting in Rome in late November last year. And so you can see that I was able to brief on Oceania, but it just gives you a sense of the degree to which the Pope is exercising leadership in this process and wants to be intimately in touch with the detail. I think the other level of leadership that we're seeing is through Cardinal Garratt, the General Secretary of the Synod of Bishops, and Cardinal Hollerich, who is to be the relator for the Assembly. And they have been writing a fair amount to the bishops of the world, and as recently as last week, to familiarise them with the process for the continental stage, but also reminding them of their episcopal role and the collegial role they have in terms of promoting the unity of the church. And what will happen with the 7 submissions that come from the continents, they will form the basis of the working document. The Latin term is Instrumentum Laboris, that will go to the Assembly in October. And just finally from me, just repeating that we will have the 2 assemblies, and of course at the end of that process there is a report sent to the Pope, who then reflects and makes final deliberations. And then there's a final quote there on the nature of synodality. There's 2 excellent documents put out by the International Theological Commission, one on the Sensus Fidei, but the other on synodality in the life and mission of the church, and I commend those for your reading. But in the interest of time, Chris, I will finish at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. That was very enlightening. It's clear that there is a lot involved in the process, and because we are a global church, of course it's complex and dynamic, and reflects the diversity of who we are as church. So it's extraordinary to see that coming through. So thank you for that enlightenment, and so that we can see our place in that whole process. Our next speaker is Francis Sullivan. Francis is from Canberra, and he was the former CEO of the Truth and Justice and Healing Council and a leader of a major church ministry. Francis is here to talk to us then about another aspect of the synodal process. So thank you, Francis, and over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and hello, everybody. I too want to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the land on which I live, and speak to you tonight. Recognise their elders past, present and emerging, and also recognise that their land was never ceded. The question before us tonight is whether we should care about the Synod on synodality. I answer that with another. Do we not sense the desire for a different church? One that is more welcoming, inclusive, and relevant to our daily lives and the lives of those we love and care for? We all know the statistics. The majority of Catholics find conventional practice and worship unattractive. Younger generations are generally disinterested in affiliation with the church, and current teachings on sexuality, marriage, and ordained ministries are appearing to be out of touch with contemporary Australian life. There is a deep disquiet brewing, a sense in the Catholic world that things are not in order, a misfit of an emerging consciousness with the conventional mindset of the institution. So far, the synodal process is revealing that disquiet. Across the globe, synodal meetings are consistently identifying how closed and rigid the church appears. Surely that is the Spirit speaking. Calls for a radical inclusion, a welcoming spirit, are being heard on every continent and in all cultures in which the church has a presence. And doesn't this make sense? Unless we open pathways for Catholics to feel they belong and that they can find in their church acceptance, moral wisdom, intelligent inquiry, then the inevitable decline of the institution will continue. Developments in the sciences, cosmology, and human nature give evidence of an expanding consciousness that calls on theology and Christian philosophy to respond accordingly. The degree to which the church can come to terms with this emerging consciousness is the degree to which it will enable itself to address the social and personal flashpoints that have led to the decline of its relevance and effectiveness. Of the many tensions the synodal process unearths, the classic one concerning authentic Catholicism is never far from the surface. This can be heard in debates over the reception of the Eucharist for divorced and remarried people, or when proposals to bless same-sex civil unions are mentioned, or whenever the reintroduction of the ordination of women for the diaconate is raised. It is even more the case in matters of sex outside of marriage. These tensions are speaking back to the church in the synodal process. They are named in the working papers and they call for resolution. I know some will say that unity is the marker of Catholicity, but it is precisely in how we hold that unity that we shape the very nature of our church. You can seek unity through assent to a common identity with unchanging characteristics and beliefs. Or you can achieve unity across difference, where the revelations of human experience are acknowledged as manifestations of divine creation. The latter is more akin to our fundamental belief that God doesn't make junk. So our challenge in this synodal process is to integrate modern understandings of human nature to bring a wholeness to our sense of being church. The normative approach to human nature we have adopted to date is too limited. It excludes and diminishes people. At worst, it judges and alienates people. It sets unrealistic existential expectations on people and in turn labours them with the heft of guilt and worthlessness. If God doesn't make junk, we must not leave people believing that they are. Anything less would be a big fail for the Synod. This has major ramifications for our Catholic beliefs and practices. It widens the tent of belonging. It recognises that God is beyond our imaginations and boundaries. It calls for a compassionate, radically inclusive, and ever-unfolding embrace of human life and an ever-deepening understanding of the social structures that oppress or liberate people, the integral cosmology we inhabit, and the mystery we are called to live. This is the spirit that underpins Pope Francis's call for the Synod on Synodality. He has implored our church to be less focused with itself and to be more missionary. He calls for a less doctrinaire and more pastoral church. This spirit is captured in the papers of the Synod. It is obviously gaining traction across the globe, so much so that the late Cardinal Pell was mounting a campaign of resistance. It is a classic clash of the church we wish to be. And as always, it comes down to the bishops. It will be how they manage their own and their collective anxieties that will lay heavily on the discernment of the pathway forward. So where will the episcopal voices go to take us beyond our fears? Their tasks of discernment are complex. They are charged to uphold the tradition, but as we've heard, also to listen to the revelation of human experience. Hopefully they will adopt a porous attitude, not be a bulwark in their disposition. The Synod documents call for radical inclusion. So just what could they reasonably consider? In short, it requires making the periphery of the church the centre. For women, this means addressing the cultural barriers, including clericalism, that discriminate and alienate their full participation. History already demonstrates that women have had more essential roles in church ministries, the diaconate included. Customs that have evolved which in turn diminish the dignity and rights of women must be immediately addressed. For the LGBTI plus community, the pastoral heart of the church must come to the fore. The same applies to divorced and remarried Catholics. None of us has the right to cast stones. Neither do we have any moral obligation to judge. Rather, we are called to embrace everyone in love. As the theologians argue over access to the Eucharist, the silence of Catholics for their brothers and sisters is deafening. Surely there is plenty of pastoral justification to include the LGBTI plus community and divorced and remarried Catholics in reception of the Eucharist as a tangible sign and sacrament of belonging. As the Pope Francis has said, the Eucharist is not a prize for the perfect, but a source of healing for us all. These two measures would be cameos of the paradigm shift a synodal church can deliver. It would demonstrate a receptivity and openness to the cry of the poor and marginalised. Of course, there will be those, like the Cardinal, who see danger signs. They will fear the loss of orthodoxy and episcopal authority. And let's face it, what could you expect if you give the masses a voice, a say in church administration, a role in ordained ministries, access to the Eucharist regardless of marital status, a blessing on committed relationships, same-sex or otherwise. Well, what you could reasonably expect is a more energised and engaged church, one that has gone to the streets, that does not act like a field hospital, but actually does act like a field hospital to bring healing, not condemnation. A church vulnerable enough to open its doors and welcome the new. And I don't know about you, but I'd pay to see that. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. That was amazing. I hear coming through strong and loud and clear the themes about communion, participation, and mission. What are we about as church? Who are we as church? And how do we reflect that diversity in our unity? And so I think those themes come through. So I'm sure there'll be questions along to you in the Q&A session, but we'll hold those at the moment, and we'll move on to the third panelist. This is a video recording again that we have, this time from Grace Rakia, who was the representative from Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands to the meeting in Melbourne where they produced the Continental document. It's really good to hear your voice, Grace, because it is the voice of the marginalised. I had 5 years of working in Papua New Guinea, so I had a great privilege of getting to know that country just a little bit, and a whole new world opened up to me. It's now a country of almost 10 million people. When I was there in the 80s, it was only 3.5, about the same size as New Zealand. We've grown to 5 million. PNG is now almost 10. It's also a very Catholic country. About 27% of the population are Catholic, and it's the largest religious denomination. So that means that there are about 3.5 million Catholics in Papua New Guinea. That's about almost 10 times what there is in New Zealand. So I'm just doing a little comparison here and putting in the context to say how important it is that we will hear your voice. So I'll hand it over to you now, Grace, and on video, David, you'll link us into that. Thank you.
Okay, so this morning I'm interviewing Grace Rakia from Papua New Guinea, and she's going to explain to us her role in Papua New Guinea, both as a paid employee of the church, but also as a volunteer. So over to you, Grace.
Thank you, Eleanor, and thank you for this invitation. I am honored to share a bit of my experience as a Catholic, as a passionate Catholic, a lay person working in the church. I come from a 3rd generation of Catholics. My grandparents were the first missionaries, then my parents, then myself. And I grew up in a very strict Catholic home where we say rosary every day, and we are all expected to go to Mass. At those early age, I didn't understand the Mass and everything, but because the parents were there with a stick at the back, go to Mass and like that. So I started from that very early age. And then eventually I got to understand some of those things we did in the church. And while I was in primary school, there was always this desire to remain in the church. Weekends I would be there, in the afternoon I would be there. Then when I went to high school, fortunately I went to attend a Mercy Sisters school, a girls' school. So I got a lot of formation from there, a lot of, prayer life. It really helped me in my faith journey. Then when I went to university, we had a youth movement called the Antioch Youth Movement. And that I think was a beautiful concept that really empowered and got young Catholics to really come out, remove and do away with those get a more self-esteem of themselves, identity where they are in the church. So I participated in that and became a leader of that movement in my diocese. Then I became a teacher. Now, when I became a teacher, knowing very well that in PNG, teachers' conditions are terrible. The pay and all terms and conditions are terrible. So I hesitantly took up the post because there was no other way for me to get an employment. As teacher was the most obvious and option. So I became a teacher. And that's when I met the De La Salle brothers. The De La Salle brothers, a teaching group of brothers, and the passion they showed in the classroom and in the school really turned my perspective around education. So, and then I wanted to find out more about them. Then eventually that my journey started from one thing to another. And now after volunteering from 2002 to 18, I took up a permanent job as a LaSallian coordinator for LaSallian activities among mostly lay partners of the De La Salle brothers, where I coordinate spiritual formation and professional development for teachers within that network, partners of the De La Salle brothers. But when I was with the De La Salle brothers, I picked up this phrase called together and by association. And together and by association, during the days of the founder, talked more strongly about the brothers working together for the running of the schools. And we take that to heart here now in PNG, that, you know, in order for us to continue to give good education to students, we need to work together and by association. And we work with the brothers, we work among ourselves, we work with our stakeholders and other arms of the church. So yeah, for when I started working, I used to say I work for the De La Salle brothers, but now I say I work with the De La Salle brothers. I see it more as a shared responsibility, and the brothers cannot be here. There are not many of them around now. So, you know, that responsibility is now in the hands of the lay people. So that's where my role is very important, and the role of lay teachers in Catholic schools to continue to keep the Catholic identity in the schools, as well as teach the students those basic things that they need in life.
Can you tell me a little bit about the faith and the Catholic life in Papua New Guinea, the people, and also your lovely statements that were on the Catholic Bishops' Facebook page?
Thank you. Yes, when I was going through this, preparing for synodality, and last year we had the General Assembly in here in PNG, the conference PNGSI. We look back at our history, and the Catholic Church is not more than 200 years old here in PNG. So basically the church it's young compared to the church in Western countries. And many of the things that I've realized in my conversation, the words that I use and the phrases, and it's sort of like, you know, it's new, or it's something that the Western church didn't use. Like I talk a lot about salvation, the salvation story. I talk a lot about, you know, using quotes or using expressions from the Bible, and using things that the founder, St. John Baptist de La Salle, in my work uses, because these are new things that people are hearing. So the church is fairly young. And when I say young also, it's like, and culturally too, we live in communities. In Papua New Guinea, our culture is very communion. You know, we don't live a one man as an island or so like that. We live together. So this concept I picked up as together by association in the LaSallian mission is very much similar to the Melanesian way, communion. We always together, everything is done for the common good. So when we make decisions, we must think of everyone in that community. So the concept of community is very strong in our culture. So that concept, again, when I see synodality, when we talk about the spirit of communion, the spirit of participation and mission, communion comes first in that category. So together, you know, we come together. So the basic Christian community, they exist everywhere in PNG. many dioceses and parishes, and when priests are not around, and we don't have so many priests now, there are many communities or churches and parishes without a priest. But it's that community that keeps the faith alive. It's that community that continues to pray throughout the week in preparation for Sunday. And when a priest is not there, there's an elder or there's a leader in that community that takes, we would say, by Bible service or something in line with what the church calendar is. So it keeps the faith alive. So community is very important. Yeah.
And could you tell me briefly about the meeting in Melbourne where you were part of the group deciding on the Oceania conversation?
Thank you. My experience of synodality whole of last year started with the General Assembly here in PNG in April, where we had priests and bishops and every walks of life coming together, and we have lay people, very simple people too, from the villages, and sitting together and talking and listening. And that meeting in Melbourne was like another experience of that synodality, where we had bishops, we had priests, we had lay people, religious, everybody together in one room. There was a shared respect for everyone, who acknowledging what they bring into the room, the experiences, the knowledge, the wisdom, and the openness of listening to everyone. And the spiritual conversation process which we use, I think really helped us to realize that sometimes we must acknowledge not just the knowledge we get from our head, but our heart as well, and the spirit. So there was a very great balance of both of that to help us to really discern and write. And that, as I said in the interview, it was a beautiful spirit. It gave me a lot of peace, knowing that, I'm very small. The country I represent is very small in size and maybe in comparison to Western countries, but it gave me a lot of sense of respect as to where I come from and appreciation of my faith and how I practice the Catholic faith in PNG.
Thank you very much, Grace. That is just the most wonderful interview. We look forward to this on our convocation next week. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Eleanor. I like this conversation. Yeah, I could talk forever, but
Thank you very much, Grace and Eleanor, for bringing us that interview. It's wonderful. What I hear from you, Grace, is that the church is very much at the grassroots, amongst alive and well, and living amongst the lay people themselves, regardless of whether there are priests or clerics or hierarchy there to lead, because it is a church of the people. And I think that's something that we in our Western countries can learn a lot from. But perhaps we'll hear more about that, and we talk about that a bit more in the question and answer session. We need to move on to the last session now. Patricia Gemmell, and Patricia's going to talk to us about, I think, particularly the situation of women. She's a leader in the Grail Australia and Australian Women Preach organisation, and the status of women in this whole process and in the church is something that is perhaps the most frequently mentioned issue that needs to be dealt with. So whether, I'll open it up to you, Patricia. Go for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Actually, I'm not going to be talking about women at all very much. Tonight I'm speaking from the lands of the Camaragal people on Sydney's North Shore. And I'd like to acknowledge that when it comes to synodality, there is so much that we can learn from First Nations peoples. I'm here to offer a grassroots perspective on the Synod as someone who was deeply engaged with the Plenary Council and who's now transferred that engagement to the Global Synod on Synodality. 2 months before this Synod officially began in October 2021, WATAC had run a Zoom forum on synodality with Dr. Alyssa Roper, and many had listened to Sister Natalie Beckar when she spoke for the Australian Cardine Institute webinar. So reform-minded groups were well and truly networking with one another, learning as much as we could, sharing information and building community. The Synod documents were excellent, and our Australian bishops did a good job of putting them all on their website, but more or less left it at that. And the deadline was prohibitive. We had barely 2 months to make a submission that required a substantial amount of reading, organising a group of willing participants, and then skillfully facilitating a spiritual conversation, writing up the collective discernment, and finally submitting it. And although I was a seasoned facilitator by now, I just could not do it. The Vatican Handbook made it clear that diocesan bishops were expected to lead in this process and to make it as inclusive of as wide a range of people as possible, especially the most vulnerable and marginalised. They were expected to initiate a wide program of synodal discernment. I don't think they did. Now, Sister Natalie had said that submissions could be made directly to the Vatican without going through diocesan channels, and I know that there were at least some reform-minded groups who chose to do so. And certainly this seemed like a good way of ensuring that our voices were heard. And yet it's also a kind of cheating, isn't it, if our discernment is only and always done in a group of the like-minded. But then again, what choice did we have? The bishops in the main failed to lead. And most of what real discernment was done at this stage depended on lay leadership. The Australian synthesis document produced by our bishops in August 2022 was little more than a disappointing catalogue of pressing issues with little sense of priorities and no sense of the crisis that we find ourselves in. So when the document for the continental stage appeared a few months later, it was like an invigorating breath of fresh air. The very title, "Enlarge the Space of Your Tent," was a hopeful sign. The people of God were invited to prayerfully study this document and discern answers to a number of questions. Our bishops put out a media release, helpfully put all the relevant information up on their website, and then left it up to the National Centre for Pastoral Research and the laity to do the rest. In spite of prohibitive time pressures once again, we are told that almost 80 groups Australia-wide, with a total of about 750 people, took up the invitation. I participated in one such group and facilitated 2 others. So where are we now and where to next? Personally, this work still energises me. I am drawn by the vision of Pope Francis for a listening church and a compassionate church. In the Synod Handbook, we're told that the purpose of our journey together is nothing less than, and I quote, to inspire people to dream about the church we are called to be, to make people's hopes flourish, to stimulate trust, to bind up wounds, to weave new and deeper relationships, to learn from one another, to build bridges, to enlighten minds, warm hearts, and restore strength to our hands for our common mission. What a wonderful vision. But we need more than vision to sustain us. The energy comes from the processes of synodality itself, which is why the practice is so important. Now, an extraordinary thing happened at the Second Assembly of the Plenary Council in July last year. We saw with our own eyes how synodality can and does work. Participants reported deep and respectful listening, the value of the spiritual conversation method, and the movement of the Holy Spirit. They spoke hopefully of a new way of being church. Onlookers, like myself, saw people sitting as equals at round tables, heard the stories, and rejoiced at some of the outcomes. With enough will and humility, capable leaders, and good structures, synodality can become a reality. But right now I feel so much resistance to change, in the reluctance of my bishop to be a leader of synodality, in the indifference of the priests in my parish, and in the lack of interest in my fellow parishioners. I know there are many good things happening in spaces far removed from parishes. I am connected to both local and global networks full of faith-filled, committed and inspiring individuals. These are what keep me going. But if I'm asked, what next? There is only one answer. We have to go back to our grassroots, even if, and especially if, nothing much is happening there. We who have reluctantly become leaders through sheer dint of just always turning up have work to do. Each one of us is responsible for this work according to our gifts. As I see it, it is a matter of bringing people together to learn and experience what it means to be a synodal church. If synodality is a matter of process and practice, then we have to make it happen. In a parish context, we can use what exists to introduce deep listening, dialogue, and discernment practices of synodality. That might be a Lenten group or a parish pastoral council. Or we can invite people to come together and learn about synodality. And there's already a growing body of easily accessible resources. Or we can create something new, like a Laudato Si group or a Bible study group, and embed synodal practices within them. Few might come, but even with a few, it is worth it. It is slow, patient work, I know, and it can often feel fruitless. But I do believe it is the challenge of the present time. And if the parish is out of the question, do it somewhere else. My friends, it is time to build a people's movement. And reflecting on our work at the grassroots, I also believe we need to have compassion for our priests. They are as much victims of the system as we are. How can we engage them without their feeling threatened? Again, not easy, especially as many of them now come from cultures unfamiliar to us. Why does the Synod matter? Well, it's one of those forks in the road, isn't it? Where we have a choice to make a difference, to dream of a different way of being church and to make it happen. It's simply the future of the church at stake. Thank you.
Wow, Patricia, that's very inspiring. Challenging words, and getting lots of reaction too through the chat, I must say. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's about us as the people of God being church and taking responsibility for our own communities, acting locally while we're thinking globally and connected globally. So, yeah. Time to open this up now to our questions that are coming from all of you people who are listening to this, and begin with Susan. As soon as I could just get this question open to me. All right, Susan, are you able to hear me? Yes, all right, she's nodding. How can the church really engage with those who are on the margins and make sure that our groups truly have a diverse membership?
Thank you. Is it Chris? Yeah, okay.
That's the question. Yes. How can the church really engage with those on the margin and make sure that our groups truly have a diverse membership?
I think the answer is it takes a lot of effort, because if you look, for example, at the Plenary Council in Australia, despite all the effort to engage, and we all know there were 17,500 submissions, you know, nearly 250,000 people contributed, but in fact, the nature of the contribution unwittingly privileged the well-educated, those who were comfortable with the written word, those for whom English was the first language, etc. And so the voices of others weren't as well heard. And similarly, when you look at the submissions that came in throughout the world, many of the writers noted those whose voices were not heard, and particularly, for example, the people who were then identified as being excluded, women although women were heard, I might say, youth, LGBTQ, there's a whole host of groups, including people with disabilities, people who are in a situation of poverty, and so on. So huge effort had to be made to engage them, and that was a particular challenge given to the organisers for the continental stage, and many of them have risen to their challenge, including in Australia. There was a dedicated session for the LGBTQI+. I know in the New Zealand submission, they had a stream in through the prison chaplains, but to issues for people who are, you know, at the margins there. They had sessions with Indigenous communities and so on. So a real effort was made, but actually we know you have to put in an additional effort, because they often will not feel that it's a natural fit. So that's what I can offer for now, but happy to elaborate. There've been some good examples of it, but also the structures, the way that we set up these consultative and submission writing structures do favour the well-educated.
That's true.
Okay, another one for you, Susan, which is perhaps related, but was there any consideration for lay representation in Suva? So this is, how do we get our lay people's voices, including those of the marginalised, through Suva? I mean, for some of us, there's a perception that, oh, it's still just the bishops and one or two hand-picked delegates who get to go to Suva. How did those people get decided? How picked on? I mean, you, for instance, how were you chosen? And how do we ensure that we do actually get some representation in Suva?
The challenge here in Australia was that the Suva Assembly, which is an assembly of the bishops, had been planned 2 years earlier. COVID intervened, the plenary council intervened, and then they scheduled it for early February. They were not excited about completely changing it, but also, to be honest, there were significant logistical issues to finding a venue and getting the budgets to fly people to Suva if you were to have equal representation. So I think there's about 200 bishops there. So if you were, most of the other ones have got groups of 3 from each Episcopal conference, so that would mean another 400 people. There was simply, it was extremely difficult. So what was done instead was we, first of all, we began really early here in Oceania, and we could, because I sit on the planning committee at the Vatican for the continental stage. So we were up and running before the document was even released. We created a task force to get this happen, and there was a huge effort put into the discernment sessions being very ecclesial across the 4 Episcopal conferences and in the Eastern churches. And there's a lot of evidence that that was the case. So then the discernment and writing group has got 3 people from each of the Episcopal conferences and the Eastern churches. So as Grace said in her interview, it was a very, if you like, respectful and inclusive session. And we created the draft document. Now, those that are going to Suva are drawn from that process, and we will present. So, you know, we are, if you like, that small group of the broader church. We will present to the bishops, and there'll be 2 discernment sessions for them there. But I think I mentioned in the presentation, at the final session, there will be the members of that discernment group and writing group, that's 20 people, and the FCBCO executive, which is about 11 people. So there'll be a good representation for that finalisation of the document before it's sent off. So we're a bit unique here in Oceania because we had those pre-established arrangements. For most of the other continents around the world, they are having assemblies which are more similar to our discernment and writing group in nature. But I think that in the circumstance in which we've operated, I think we've probably done about as good as we could, to be honest.
So am I right in understanding that in those sessions talking about the Synod on Synodality, there will be 20 people, that delegates from the different regions, meeting with the 11 bishops and cardinals and so on. So there is some kind of a writing of balance or imbalance in favour of lay people then. Is there any suggestion that we could be moving towards an ecclesial conference rather than having a church that's run by an Episcopal conference, as along the lines of what's happening in Germany, for instance?
Look, I think what's happening is that as people experience synodality, including the bishops and others, they find they can see it's not threatening. They can see that it's actually it's energizing the church and bringing other voices into the church. And so, and as Pope Francis, he talks about it as the way of the church in the future. So this is the way of being church. And of course, it means there's some significant issues that have got to be addressed. So, for example, in the draft, and I noticed one of the questions was, when will people see the Oceania draft? Like, it is a document of the FCBCO, but each of the Episcopal conferences have put their submissions on the website. So I think that my sense is that they'll be quite open to sharing that draft when it's finalised, and that ought to be say toward early to mid-March. I would have thought that would be ready. The deadline is in March. But the question was really, are we moving in the right direction? And I think, yes, we are. You made Patricia, you made the point of having some compassion for the local priests. One of the really interesting features of the submissions that came through was, first of all, there was critique of priests, that's for sure, for boring sermons, too busy to be pastoral, and so on and so on. But there was great sympathy as well for understanding that the bind that they're in. But also, the priest's voice was almost absent. And that was very interesting, because it seemed as though they stood aside to give the lay people, almost universally, stood aside to give the lay people a voice. And so that's not a situation you want in the future. You want to be walking together. That's the whole point of it, that we work together. And when you think about the circumstance in the church in almost every country, the church needs lay people right now. They need the resource, the gifts, the skills, the expertise, because they're not there within the ordained and consecrated life. There's just not enough of them. So going back, Christina, to your question, I think this is a time in the road. I think I'm borrowing again from you, Patricia, a fork in the road, that this is a moment in the life of the church, and we can work. You know, we've got enormous challenges, but I think we can work together to create the kind of vision of church that Pope Francis has put in front of us. So thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if I can bring the discussion now to you, Patricia, again, to talk more at that the local level. And the question is, what will happen to the church? What can the church really? Sorry, no, I'll get the right question. It keeps moving on my screen. Can we expect synodality to filter down to the people at the parishes? And so I'm thinking about how in the 80s and 90s, even earlier, 70s and 80s, there were parish councils set up and very actively involved with liturgy committees and all sorts of groups reflecting the different needs in the community, youth groups, elderly, whatever. And many of these parish councils have just disappeared.
Yes, well, our parish council has just our parish council has recently disappeared, and in fact, yes, we're going to have some discernment sessions in our parish shortly to kind of look at our mission and perhaps try and get a parish council going again. Look, I think, you know, every parish is so different, but the question, you know, will synodality filter down? Well, it certainly isn't filtering down at the moment very much at all. What I see happening in my local areas is really lay people stepping up and kind of becoming leaders, feeling there's a vacuum there, and so you step up and you do it. The trouble is that there are very few of those people. There are very few of those people who actually want to step up and do the work. The labourers are few. Maybe they've always been few, but you can only do what you can do, and keep doing it.
Francis, do you want to make a comment on that question, and perhaps even more broadly then about the governance structures in parishes and then all the way through diocese and nationally?
Well, yes, thank you. Obviously, for a synodal church to be something we experience in our local setting, there needs to be a commitment on the part of all people in that setting to deal with each other in a mutual way, not in a hierarchical way. And we still have not addressed the culture of clericalism, either the overt aspects of it or the subtlety of it.
Yeah.
There is always the priest and the laity. Well, in synodality, we're talking about the equality of the baptized. So we need to move our minds away from any sense of hierarchical structuring. For us in the West, our instincts are democratic. So we should always be doing things that are enhancing the democracy of ourselves together. We should always make choices that promote the equality of rights together. And the last point I'd make is, if we are going to seek out people in the periphery, let's be clear why. We're not asking them to come back into our church. We're asking them, can we walk together to create church? It's a different disposition. It's about going to them and, in a sense, saying, do we have permission to walk with you? Since, for whatever reason, you have walked from us. And therefore, we need that sense of vulnerability and humility in order for something like radical inclusion to work on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. It kind of leads to another question. What will happen if the church, if the cardinals and the bishops watered down these urgent pleas for change submitted by so many groups? So it's about the leadership that comes at that next level.
One of the things when you look, say, through the Magisterium of Vatican II, but also some of the documents I mentioned from the International Theological Council, they're really very clear that the bishop, in coming to the difference between decision making and decision taking, in taking the decision, the bishop should be listening to the voices of the lay faithful. And having read many, I can't say all, but most of the submissions that came through in the first phase, I think there was an authenticity to them. And in some cases, the bishops did write their own statement. I'm thinking of one that was very direct, very frankly written. It was the UK, it's up on their website. But then there's a statement of about 2 pages at the end where the bishops pretty much saying, yeah, okay, but we're still here. So they're not disowning or disagreeing. It's been written by people appointed by them, and they're acknowledging it, but they're also acknowledging that they have a role and a presence. And so I can see, I think, the submissions, the 4 submissions for the Episcopal Conferences that we looked at in Melbourne a couple of weeks ago, and the one from the Eastern Churches, they definitely seem to be quite unfiltered. They're very direct, they're very frank, They're speaking the issues as they are. So I'm hopeful that that's what will emerge from the SUVA meetings. And perhaps I can give an anecdote that came from Frascati, and that is that when the members of the council came to Frascati, some of them were quite disturbed really by the findings. And Cardinal Garratt had to repeatedly remind them that this wasn't something concocted by the group of people who had got together. This was a faithful synthesis of what the people of God around the world had said. And so that's why most people who read the document for the continental stage, they find that it's got an integrity to it. And, you know, as someone who was involved in it, I can, you know, really attest to that. So I understand why many people are cynical and cautious, but certainly what I've seen to date, I think most of the bishops are taking on board that role that they have to listen to their people before they make decisions. And at the end of the day, this is a submission from the whole church in Oceania, not just from the ordained. So I remain hopeful. I hope that's proven to be correct.
Yes, and I must admit that as I read the statement, the response to the continental document from New Zealand, one of the things that strikes me is the commonalities that people are reading in the themes that are coming through globally. And so, yeah, that's something that, yes, does confirm that it is the Spirit that's working through all of us. So it's a kind of a final round of questions to draw this all together. I wonder if each of you would give me a couple of minutes on just what do you find gives you hope and joy to strengthen you on this journey. I don't know who wants to start. Francis, do you want to start? Or Patricia, whatever.
Well, that's easy, really. It's scripture, it's prayer, and it's my companions on the journey.
Okay, nice and short.
Mm.
Francis, what gives you hope and joy to strengthen you on this journey?
Well, I've always been clear about the spiritual journey is what it's all about. I mean, being part of a church helps, but it's not essential. And I think the more I stay true to my own spiritual practice and journey, happier I am. And it gives me a sense of direction in dialogue with others who are like-minded and want to be on the faith journey. It's a journey of transformation at a personal level and at a structural level. That's where you find the patience, and we all need to be patient, but we do need to be positive and concerted, and you can only find the strength in your inner well.
Mm.
Thank you. And Susan?
I think part of it for me is the leadership of Pope Francis, which is why I put it into the presentation. I was really taken in August 2018 when he wrote the letter to the people of God. And it was a dreadful year in the life of the church. We'd had the Australian Royal Commission report in December 2017, the Pennsylvania grand jury report in about April. We had then the Chilean bishops. I mean, there was just dreadful revelations coming out everywhere. And he wrote the letter to the people of God that in essence was saying, the hierarchical church can't manage this alone. We need you to get involved. And the reason I thought it was very powerful, first of all, it wasn't filtered through the normal sources. It was put out on the internet. So if you like, direct communication. But secondly, it was a way of authorizing ordinary Catholics to become involved. And then what he says in the various statements he makes around synodality is emphasizing all the time, it's your baptism, it's your baptismal call. And when you look at the various documents that have been written, they go back to the scripture of John. You are anointed, and it's that anointing that gives you, if you like, an equal prophetic calling. So I find that very motivating, and I have this sense that that I didn't necessarily expect in my lifetime, that I would have the opportunity to contribute to a re-energizing of the church, which as we know, really needs the people of God to get, all the people of God to get involved. So that's what keeps me going.
Yes.
Wonderful. I think that really is inspiring. It's that empowerment that comes from us all recognizing that we are baptized with one baptism. There isn't a hierarchy of baptisms, whereas each one of us is as Catholic as the Pope, and that authorization to live the Spirit as the Spirit calls each of us, I think is very empowering. I hope that it's been a wonderful convocation. Thank you all so much. I hope that we will bring your voices and the voices of so many people who have put their questions through the chat, which we haven't been able to answer in full, but we will draw from and make a statement that will go to Suva for next week. So we're going to have to get our skates on and get organised, and perhaps it's not too late to have some impact, but yeah. That's our hope with this, is that this is a convocation. It's not just a talk fest, but it will actually convey your feelings, your views, and the Spirit who is leading us and speaking through us to that meeting in Suva next week. So thank you all again. Thank you, Garratt Publishing, for coordinating this for us, David working behind the scenes there, and Francis, Susan, Patricia, also Grace, and Archbishop Costello for your words through video. I think with that we'll leave it, and there will be a recording of this convocation which you can access at a later date. Thank you all.